Let me ask you a question. What constitutes the most balanced, averagely priced PC build in terms of CPU and GPU relation? Keep your answer in mind throughout this video and let's see if your viewpoint changed by the end. My main testing rig contains a Ryzen 9 3900X. That isn't a new CPU by any standards, and it is pretty common for me to use that chip in a GPU testing. Many people argue against using it to test powerful GPUs, such as 7800 XT and 6900 XT, as showcased in one of our previous videos. Their rationale revolves around this logic. A modern computer consists of two primary components, the CPU and the GPU. Installing an outdated or weaker CPU, like i3-2100, will result in a lackluster performance, even with an RTX 4090. The opposite holds true as well. Having a top-tier CPU like 7800X 3D won't yield optimal results if paired with a low-end graphics card like the GT 1030. Therefore, to properly test modern graphics card, you need to have an up-to-date testing rig, and to test a recently released CPU, you need a GPU that won't bottleneck it, ideally something high-end. When confronted with this argument, it's not entirely baseless. It sounds reasonable on surface. However, reality, as usual, is more complex than this simplistic concept suggests. For many of you, this video might cover obvious points, especially if you follow Daniel Owen or some other testers. Yet I haven't encountered a thorough explanation of the bottleneck phenomenon on YouTube, so let's delve into it. Hello and welcome back to Hardware Lab. It may sound obvious, but did you ever try to fully understand why a computer with 7800X 3D and GT 1030 doesn't achieve great benchmark results? Simply because the components don't match and they expect you to buy an expensive CPU with an expensive GPU and vice versa?
Looking to build a new gaming PC, the chances are you're in the market for a great GPU and CPU combo. These two components are easily the most important parts to get right in any build. So with this in mind and so many choices of CPUs and GPUs that you can pick up, just which ones are the best? And how do you ensure a balanced CPU and GPU combo that will set your build up for success? Well, in this video, I'm going to talk about how to pick the best combo for your budget and look at performance as we go.
Hello and welcome to the Scatterable channel, and today I want to bring you guys the best CPU and GPU combinations you can purchase in 2023. If you're a first-time PC builder or you're looking to build a gaming PC this year and you don't know what graphics card and processor combination is going to yield you the most amount of performance at a certain price category, then you come to the right place.
Make this super simple. Gaming PC performance mostly comes down to three components, which are your CPU, RAM, and GPU. All three of these components need to work together, and if one of these components is the weak point, that could degrade the performance of the entire group. Let's say you have 16 gigabytes of 6000 megahertz RAM with an RTX 4070, they can work together perfectly fine. Now imagine if your CPU for that group is like an Intel 2-core super slow CPU, that would of course be the bottleneck. Your game performance would be heavily degraded because of that CPU, and therefore the GPU could only get up to like 5 or 10% utilization. When your GPU or any other component can't reach its full potential because it's being held back by a different component, that's when you have a bottleneck. When purchasing parts for your PC, you need to make sure that all three parts are balanced and
RAM and GPU work together perfectly fine. Okay, let me explain. Consider this frame from control. In a single second, your PC generates at least 40 such frames to ensure the game's playability. Let's examine what constitutes this particular frame. First and foremost, there is a geometric mesh composed of polygons, each formed by 3 vertices, given the triangle shape. Calculating the coordinates of each vertex in 3-dimensional space is solely the realm of the CPU. Some objects, like buildings, remain static in one place, while others are in motion, governed by complex movements equations. The AI controlling NPCs, for instance, employs various algorithms. Civilians use different pathfinding formulas when traversing visible areas compared to enemies trying to attack the player. Moreover, NPCs aren't merely in constant motion. They exhibit animations requiring realistic movements of their limbs of each frame. Their claws might react to wind, or at least move in a way that corresponds to their motion. Apart from NPC claws, every scene contains various physical objects, and most of these calculations are handled by the CPU. After all those calculations, the CPU sends some commands to the GPU on the language GPU understands. Those commands are known as draw calls and transmit the required information to the GPU. First, it needs to do the basic rasterization process and texture application, producing data on the positioning of specific parts of 3D geometry meshes and their corresponding colors in a 2D space of a defined resolution. Subsequently, it applies different shaders, such as ambient occlusion, reflections, IBL, shadows, etc. It's crucial to note that not all games operate in this manner. The implementation of certain modern technologies can alter the polygon mesh based on the resolution used. Some physics libraries may also process on the GPU instead of the CPU, among other variations. Nevertheless, the fundamental concept holds true. The CPU and GPU do different tasks in games. This is where the key to understanding the bottleneck lies. Take a look at this scene from Starfield, captured at the heart of New Atlantis City. The mesh quality and scale here are mind-blowing, substantially loading the CPU. Let's assume our hypothetical CPU can provide 200k draw calls a second within the Starfield engine. However, New Atlantis, with its complexity, requires 5k just to render one frame. Consequently, the CPU can provide enough instructions for the GPU to render 40 frames per second. When using a high-end card, it won't be a problem. It will render all 40 frames and still leave some resources unused, so the GPU load sensor will report underload. But what about the low-end card? Well, it may be only capable of rendering 20 frames per second, and since the CPU can provide enough and even more instructions than needed for those 20 frames, we will see 20 FPS, with the sensor reporting nearly 100% load. This other shot further away from the city has less complex geometry. Nonetheless, the graphics quality remains largely unchanged, applying almost the same shaders at a consistent quality level. Although there would be a disparity in GPU performance between these scenes, the variance in required draw calls is incomparable. Let's assume this scene necessitates only 2k draw calls to provide all the required instructions to render one frame. That will mean that our CPU, capable of 200k draw calls a second, will provide enough instructions to render 100 FPS. Now the amount of instructions might saturate even the high-end graphics card, resulting in nearly 100% load reported by the sensor, delivering around 90 FPS. Conversely, the low-end GPU would show a slight improvement compared to the previous scene, rendering at approximately 25 FPS while still operating at full capacity. All that can be easily changed with the different settings. For instance, reducing the rendering resolution by applying FSR or DLSS, the amount of work for the GPU will be significantly reduced, both from the amount of rasterization it's gonna do and the lower shaders resolution, since they are usually connected to render resolution. But from the CPU point of view, not much is gonna change. In some games, lower res could automatically slightly affect render distance or something, but in general, the amount of instructions or draw calls will be the same. Or we can change a shadow resolution setting, and the CPU won't notice that, because basically what it does is making a draw call containing a message, "Hey mate, we need a shadow from object X with an angle Y." But would it be soft? Would it be 4K or pixelated mess? It doesn't know. Recall what I mentioned earlier, in some games physics is calculated by CPU, in others by GPU. Some games have a pretty rich polygon mesh but poor shader quality, and others vice versa. Moreover, different people prefer different experiences. I'm pretty sure you have a friend who plays with a controller and says, "I don't care about those 30 FPS, I care about visually stunning shiny reflections." Again, all these examples are pretty simplified, but emphasize the broader point. Game engines, and even games built on the same engine, differ in their preferred CPU-GPU balance. Different scenes within a single game can demand more from the CPU or GPU, not to mention individual preferences that diverge significantly from others. Your choice of in-game settings, some affecting the CPU, some affecting the GPU, and some both, aligns with these preferences. That's the counter-argument to what was said in the start of the video. I was testing all the games in a GPU limited scenario in the video about 7800 XT and 16900 XT. Therefore, even using a 7800X 3D wouldn't yield different results because the CPU adequately provides roll calls for those GPU to be fully loaded in those particular games using that particular settings and resolutions. It doesn't mean 3900X is enough for 7800 XT, or not enough. Rather, it means it offers enough instructions or draw calls in those particular scenarios, allowing for a comparative analysis of results. Of course, there are instances where 3900X falls short even for low-end cards, as well as scenarios where it suffocates for RTX 4090, making a test involving a 3900X and 4090 entirely fair. Another problem with CPU-GPU relations that might occur is that while you can switch between CPUs and achieve similar results when GPU limited across the entire testing section, the reverse isn't applicable. This discrepancy doesn't stem from any mythical link between CPU and GPU performance, but primarily due to driver and/or GPU architecture, a phenomenon often termed driver overhead. To elaborate, the GPU comprehends instructions from the CPU in its own language, facilitated by driver software running on the CPU, explaining how the particular GPU operates. This driver software's complexity and quality can vary. Generally, newer GPU architectures tend to handle this aspect better. When newer architectures are installed and the system is CPU limited, better performance is observed compared to older architectures. Notably, this driver overhead effect appears most noticeable on Intel GPUs, least on AMD, as detailed in a separate video dedicated to exploring this effect. By the way, people were mad that I am comparing 6900 XT with A770. Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing, sure. Other than driver overhead, the CPU comparisons with different GPUs in the testing rigs are generally acceptable, with some minor effect of the weaker GPU even providing better results. But yeah, not today's topic. Okay, to make all the stuff clear, let's finally do some testing. We'll test Radeon RX 7800 XT Sapphire Pure with automatic driver overclock mode on a Ryzen 5 3600 with a pretty standard RAM at 3600 CL16-16-1636 versus the same GPU on a Ryzen 5 5600X and the same RAM. As usual, all the tests for the final graphs were captured on a separate run from the recording, and the tests were done multiple times to avoid randomness. By the way, Ryzen 3600 is emulated by switching off one CCD unit of 3900X. This emulation is pretty accurate, since it doesn't even have a cache advantage over the real thing. According to some YouTube commentators and YouTubers, there should be a really huge difference in performance, right? If there is any difference in Starfield, then the 3600 build is even faster. It probably happens due to a different time of the day or some other factors out of our control, but surprise surprise, both systems are almost identical, because both of them are GPU limited. If you have watched the introduction and didn't skip straight to the test section, it is already clear to you that GPU limitation means equal performance for whatever system. In fact, 3600 is even slightly faster again for unknown reason. Anyway, the difference is within the margin of error. It is a really interesting trend that the 3600 system is slightly faster again. Do you have any ideas what could lead to that behavior? The only thing I have in mind is that the auto overclocking mode in the driver can behave slightly differently from time to time, which can be proved by a bit of a different frequency. Anyway, the test proves the point again. Better CPU does not equal better performance when GPU is a limiting factor. Almost exactly the same performance frame to frame is achieved in Returnal. Didn't you get the pattern already? To be fair, I'm already bored of talking about these results. I mean, it's kind of fun that you can stop the video on random frame, screenshot that and prove that a better CPU is doing better despite being GPU limited, but then you can also prove the opposite thing with the other screenshot. Wow, did we finally find a game where CPU can affect GPU performance? Not really, but this test is kinda cool. It is clear that the Ryzen 3600 test run is CPU limited, and that's the reason for the worst performance. Take a look at the GPU load sensor. But when we get GPU limited again, the difference disappears. If all the previous games weren't enough, Alan Wake is here to prove the point again. GPU limitation scenario tests GPU performance, which CPU has nothing to do with. Does all that test means that the Ryzen 5 3600 is enough for 7800 XT and the CPU upgrade is now pointless? Well, if you prefer playing these games, in these settings, yeah, for sure. However, it's crucial to note that even within the same set of games, it's quite easy to discern differences between the systems. We simply need to use different settings for comparison, and that's what we are going to do. It's important to emphasize that we aren't fabricating unrealistic scenarios just to support a particular point. While some may find the measured FPS acceptable, others might feel it's inadequate and opt to adjust settings or lower the resolution to achieve better performance. The ideal trade-off between reducing quality for improved performance varies for each person based on their preferences. Maybe the difference between these CPUs and Starfield is not as massive as you expected, but it is clear that when GPU limitation is not the case, CPU becomes a bottleneck, and because 5600X is a better CPU by any standards, it provides more FPS with a better frame time graph. In the beginning of the test, 3600X actually shows better results on the recording at times. This can be explained by a GPU limitation on the 5600X side and the way Relive used GPU's CPU resources, as well as an auto overclocking margin. However, when GPU limitation is obviously not a factor, we can clearly see that the 5600X does a better job, and that wasn't the case when we were GPU limited. This test is pretty interesting as well. When GPU limitation is not the case, 5600X is faster as expected, but when it is the case, the difference disappears, pretty much as what we've seen in Watch Dogs in the previous section. Again, there is a slight mystery GPU performance loss that is probably explained by randomness of auto-overclocking, benchmark or whatever else on the 5600X side, but it still proves the point. The difference between the CPUs would be even bigger in this test if we weren't limited by GPU performance in most parts of the benchmark on a 5600X. This is a clear example where 5600X is almost enough to test 7800 XT, but 3600 not. If you wanted to test this GPU on these settings, you would require 5600X for this test, on these particular settings. Remember our previous section? On the other settings, much more GPU demanding, you could do the test on 3600 just fine. Exactly the same thing is true for Dope 5. 5600X almost enough to test 7800 XT on these settings. 3600 not at all, despite the opposite was true on different settings in the previous section. Remember the previous test of Watch Dogs Legion? There was no difference when we were GPU limited on both systems. Well, on the other settings the difference is almost always there, since GPU limitation is unachievable here for 3600. And again the same result. Changing the settings makes CPU a limiting factor, at least for the 3600 system, and the difference that wasn't there at all became obvious. So what do you think now? Does the combo of 3600 and 7800 XT make sense? Is it a good optimal combo? Both yes and no. It depends on preferences, but the comparison between two CPUs using this card would be valid if someone decides to do it, as well as the comparison between 7800 XT and some other GPU as soon as they are both bottleneck the system in the particular tested scenario. And this bottleneck is indicatable. I mean, some of you could definitely think that Ryzen 5 3600 is not enough even for something like 3060, right? Of course, then it's not enough for the 7800 XT as well. And if we compare these cards between each other on Ryzen 5 3600, we would be wrong. 5600X should show a much bigger difference, with a bigger advantage on the 7800 XT side. Well, let's give it a try. It can be easily observed that both CPUs fully suits this test. The difference between 3060 and 7800 XT is obvious, and what's more important is identical, no matter the CPU used in the test. So theoretically, if your goal was to compare these cards and show how faster 7800 XT is in this game and on these settings, 3600 would do the job perfectly. Better CPU won't be necessary. Same stuff here, at least on these settings and in this game. 3600 is enough to do the comparison between the cards, and enough to demonstrate the advantage of the higher end 7800 XT. What a surprise, same thing again. Imagine it was some dude's video comparing mid and high-end cards. Their comment section would be full of people saying to throw their rubbish CPU away cause it limits the 7800 XT's potential, despite them doing everything right. So the results are identical. Yes, they should be when we are GPU limited in both cases. And all the tests made on whatever old CPU are valid if GPU limitation is a thing, as well as CPU tests when GPU limitation is not a thing, with the condition of driver overhead taken in mind. That's also why my driver overhead comparison between Intel Arc and Radeon was valid, and AMD didn't get any advantage in this test from me using a top tier card. I know it must be obvious for a lot of you, as I said, but the level of ignorance and stupidity on that topic in the net and on YouTube is just crazy, with some YouTubers unironically making the list of CPUs and GPUs that are best bang for buck together and perfectly fit each other, despite the whole concept make no sense at all. This kind of advice only prevents viewers from buying the hardware that suits them, while they can spend 20 minutes more on research and buy the system they really need. Okay, conclusion. There is no connection between the CPU and GPU performance. They are doing different tasks in games that can be described as building a geometrical mesh and preparing the instructions for rendering, and rendering with a set quality of shaders. Different conditions such as game engines, settings, render resolution massively impact on this GPU-CPU relation, so that there is no clear correlation between CPUs and GPUs that fit each other. By the way, did you change your opinion about the balanced average priced PC build? I hope I have helped some people to understand what's going on with the Bottleneck today. If so, consider subscribing for more content on computer hardware, and as usual, stay up to date with HL.